So what do you make about sort of the general state of religion altogether? Not just Judaism, but the general state of religion in America in 2017. I mean, by most polls, we see that
in America,
yeah, the amount of non-believers is growing tremendously. Atheists growing tremendously. I think Jedi's up there, which I'm okay with that one. Do you sense that religion as an institution is weakening in America?
I think I like the way you ask the question because I think what is weakening are institutions. I think institutions in general don't have the appeal that they once did. People don't want to sit in buildings and pray. They want to go out. They want to be on mountaintops. They want to be on hikes. I think the feeling that religion speaks to is not lessening, but I think that the organization and the institution speaks less to people than it once did.
What do you do about that as a rabbi? You got a nice big building.
I think you're right, exactly. Well, actually, it's funny because I have an article coming out this week in the Los Angeles Jewish Journal about writing about taking services outside. Part of the reason is that I think that especially younger people don't feel connected to the buildings that they didn't build. After all, the generation before them built this building, feel great about it, but they inherited it. So what you do about it, I think, is you reconfigure religion. And when I said earlier that I didn't know what Judaism would look like in 100 years, my assumption was that it will look different. And one of the ways that it'll look different is I suspect that it will reintegrate into the natural world in a way that we haven't so far, at least in America. And I don't.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that the idea of worship in nature, and the idea not of worship of nature, but worship in nature, the idea of meditation and alternative ways of connecting to the Jewish tradition and using the learning of the Jewish tradition to open as opposed to only have narrower communities will become a greater and greater trend. So you will have probably two different kinds of Jewish communities. Ones that are more self-sufficient and more institution-based, and others that I think are looser and broader.
So basically the sort of Orthodox ones that you referenced earlier, they'll keep all that sort of older stuff.
I think, although there are challenges to Orthodoxy that it's going to be very hard for the community to, and the principal ones are the challenge of the position of women, which is a constant issue in the Orthodox community, and inclusion, LGBTQ inclusion, which is also a challenge to the Orthodox community.
Yeah, so we're in LA. You said I could ask you anything.
Yes.
I see these ultra-Orthodox guys out there. It's 100 degrees in Los Angeles.
Yep.
They're wearing a big wool coat, a big wool hat. This can't be what God wants. Come on.
Well,
you walking down Wilshire,
the reason that they're wearing, if you ask exactly, that's the point. The point is that dress wasn't originally Jewish dress. It was the dress of Polish noblemen in the 19th century, which is why, as a conservative Jew, I say history clearly affects the way Jews practice. But at a certain point, people who are, if not conservative, then reactionary, what they tend to do is they pick a period in history which is the ideal period, and they try to recreate that period over and over and over and over and over again, wherever they are, wherever they go, like the clock has stopped. It's a strategy that works in some ways, but I think in other ways is unproductive. So.
All right, I think that, fair enough. You mentioned the LGBT community.
Yes.
You were for gay marriage, something like 6 years ago, before it was legal here.
Yeah.
How did your congregation take it? Did you have to take counsel with other rabbis to say that you wanted to say this, etc.? I
mean, the uproar was so great in my congregation that when I announced that I was going to do gay marriages, it literally was on the front page of the New York and the LA Times.
Wow.
That's how upheavalish, to coin a phrase, it was. There were a lot of people in my congregation.
That was after it was legal in California, but not yet legally.
Right, but not yet legal, but it was before the Supreme Court decision. Okay. My congregation, and I had waited until I thought it wouldn't split my congregation apart. My congregation was, many people were very supportive. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. Many were very upset. Part of the reason that many were upset is not only because some were conservative, but also I think there were some, I again don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but I have my congregation is about half from Iran, and many who had immigrated from Iran, for them this was a giant cultural shift that they really didn't like. So for me, it was, here was sort of the contrast that I was struck with. I knew that it was going to be, I didn't know it was going to be quite as big as it turned out to be. I knew it was going to be big, and I prepared it. I taught a series of classes and so on, and then I wrote a letter about why I was doing it. And before I sent it out, I wanted my daughter to know. She was at the time, I guess, about 14 or 15. I wanted her to know because she was going to hear stuff, and she went to a school with a lot of people from the congregation, and I thought people might say bad things about me, and I wanted her to know what I was doing. Mm-hmm. So I said, Samara, I just want you to know, I'm sending this letter out to the congregation to say that I'm going to start doing same-sex marriages. And she looked at me strangely, and she said, what took you so long? And I said, yes, that's the point.
Yeah.
The point is that this is a huge generational shift, the biggest one I think maybe humanity has ever seen in one generation, from the people for whom it was really inconceivable. It was like I was saying I was going to marry Martians. They couldn't imagine how a rabbi could even think of doing such a thing. Mm-hmm. To someone who said, well, it was like I was saying to her, I'm now going to marry people who are blonde to people who are redhead.
Right.
So it was incredible.
So I'm curious then, well, first off, it strikes me that you're in a particularly unique situation because generally American Jews are liberal. You're in a congregation in Los Angeles, which is uber
on the west
liberal.
side of Los Angeles.
On the west side of Los Angeles. I mean,
that is not liberal.
And your congregation is not liberal.
No.
That's sort of like just a fascinating little insider mix into what you're sort of dealing with there. So when I've had other people on that have argued from a Jewish perspective, when we've talked about marriage, so when I've had Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager on and we've talked about this kind of thing, both of them have basically got it to the point of saying they're not really for it, but that this is where their libertarianism sort of takes over, so just get the state out of it and I don't care. Yours doesn't seem to come from that place.
No. I think that's, I don't, let me just put it this way, without insulting any individual, I don't approve of that point of view, and I don't honestly have a great deal of admiration for it.
Well, why not just for the government should be out of religion, or government should be out of your right to marry, and that's that?
Well, because the only reason that they're saying that, they didn't feel that 10 years ago, the only reason that they're saying that is because the cultural backlash against saying, the government shouldn't do that is too great. So I think that they're being forced into a more moral position, but it's not because they advocated it. And if you think that it's okay if you think that people shouldn't do it, then don't say people shouldn't. They wouldn't say that about abortion. Right. I mean, if you really think that there's a moral issue here, then stand up for the moral issue and make a case for it.
Yeah. For the record, I basically said that to both of them.
Because I think there is a moral issue here, and the moral issue here is that when someone comes to me and says, it's not, the other day there was a cover story on this about people who've come out in the gay community in the Orthodox community and how they're struggling with it. And as I read through it, I just thought there's not enough of an acknowledgement that your sexual identity, it's fundamental to who you are. It just is. It's not like the clothes you wear. It's not, that I don't like mushrooms. It's not, I'm a vegetarian. It's not nearly as fundamental to me, right, as my sexual identity.
Right.
So when someone comes to you and says, this is how I was born, this is how God made me. And if it's not whatever connection of genetics, or I didn't choose this is who I am. Mm-hmm. And you're telling me that in the Jewish tradition, there is no place for me to express my love to the only kind of people that I can love this way? Mm-hmm. Who can say no to that? I mean, who can say, I'm sorry, but you have to put away who you are because there's a verse in Leviticus?
So I think a lot of people are going to be watching this, people that are non-believers, but some people who are believers of whatever faith.
And they won't like this, but okay.
I was going to say the reverse. I think they're going to say, holy shit, I've been waiting for someone of faith to say that.
I mean, look, some of the most moving experiences that I've had have been a result of this. In fact, I have to say this sounds very strange, but it didn't sound strange to me. The most romantic moment I have ever seen at a wedding was the first wedding I did between two men. And I can tell you, I mean, they taped the whole thing. I'm sure that I won't identify them, but one of them turned to the other. They decided they wanted to do vows. And so I said, sure, if you want to do vows at your wedding, you do vows at your wedding. So one of them said, I want to tell you when I decided to marry you. One night you fell asleep first. You always fall asleep first. And I was looking at you and I started to cry. And I woke you up. And you said, what? And I said, you have to promise me that I'll die first, because I can't stand the idea of being in this world without you. And you looked at me with just infinite tenderness and you said, I promise. And then you fell right back asleep. But at that moment, I decided I wanted to marry you. And when he said that, first of all, there was not a dry eye in the house. And I thought anybody who would witness this moment and say, this is an abomination, I have a very hard time with.
Yeah. So, all right. So you make this decision. Now,
Yeah.
that strikes me also as somewhat unique because you don't have to clear that with anyone, right? Like the conservative movement,
no,
they have
right.
sort
The
of...
conservative movement does not. Right. The conservative movement has the latitude. Some do and some don't, but they knew. Yeah. And I let my congregation, I let the key people in my congregation know that I was going to do this, but I didn't ask their permission.
Yeah. Wait, what do you mean some do and some don't? Meaning...
In other words, some conservative rabbis will do gay marriages and some won't.
Oh, so there isn't something like written in the...
Right. No.
The guide, like it's like a party platform sort
There
of,
is,
right?
there is a committee of law and standards, but they basically said, you know, you're going to have to make this decision on your own.
Yeah. Did you go to find counsel with some other rabbis and other...
I read a lot of what was written about it, but I knew that I wanted to do it. I mean, my question was tactical. My question was, how do I do this with minimum damage to my community? Because what had happened to me was several years before, a young man who was gay came to me and said, why won't you do gay marriages? And I said, I'm going to give you an answer, but you won't like it. I said, but here's the truth. I want to. I said, but I sort of feel, if you'll forgive the grandiosity of the analogy, I feel like Abraham Lincoln did at the beginning of the Civil War, which is you don't issue the Emancipation Proclamation before you're ready. Mm-hmm. I said, if I do it now, it's going to tear my community apart. I said, and I have to wait until they're ready. It'll still be a big thing, but it won't tear them apart because I'm the rabbi of a community. That wasn't good enough for him. I completely understand that,
yeah.
But that was my job.
Were you ever able to reconcile that with him at any point?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. I came back to him and I said, this is why I don't know, he still would have preferred, I'm sure, that I had done it years before, sure. But at least I did it.
Yeah.
And also I think he was pleased at how big a splash it made, because that made him feel proud.
Yeah.
You know.
What kind of backlash did you get?
I had a lot of people who threatened to resign, although only a couple did, and at least of the couple who did, one came back. I got a lot of really not nice letters, attacks, one of which I shared with you, some private, yeah. Some public.
Yeah.
And also, but the hardest part was that I hurt people that I really care about. Because there were people who were like good people and kind people, and they identify with their rabbi, and they can't, how could you do this? I mean, that's how they felt. It's like, how could you possibly do this?
Yeah.
But I told my daughter, again, to return to my daughter, during the Boer War, Churchill said, it's exhilarating to be shot at without result. And I said to her, the lesson here is, if you really believe in something, the people who love you will still love you, and sooner or later the world will move on, and you will have the satisfaction of having done what you know is right, and you'll survive. So it was, in that sense, it was a beautiful experience, even though it was a hard one.
How do you navigate those other political pieces? Because I'm sure there's a constant battle between trying to remain neutral
funny because,
and also what a clergyman is legally allowed to do.
Well, there are political
pieces.
There are different kinds of political pieces. I mean, there's politics in the synagogue itself. And then I actually wrote, I occasionally write columns for Time online. And I wrote a column against repealing the Johnson Amendment. The Johnson Amendment is the one where you shouldn't I don't think rabbis should endorse candidates. Mm-hmm. I think that that's a mistake, and you shouldn't ask them to, because then you're going to have the Republican shul and the Democratic shul, and that's not good.
Yeah.
But my basic political orientation is I will be a firm supporter of Israel from the pulpit and any other venue I can. But am I going to take a position as a rabbi on taxes? No. Am I going to take a position on most political issues. I think that it's not I will do it interpersonally. You ask me personally, I will tell you. But as a rabbi, I think I only ought to take a position on things that are clearly Jewish, where I think that Judaism speaks fairly univocally on them. You know.
Do you get pushed into sometimes having to talk about things that you don't want
Absolutely.
to talk about?
Yes, I do sometimes. Which, okay, that's fair. I mean, it's not as though you don't have a community and they don't have a say. Sometimes they have a say too. You know, and they say, we really want you to talk about this and tell us what you think. When I told you, I gave the invocation at the Democratic National Committee. A lot of my congregation was very upset at that. I said to them, listen, if the Republicans had asked me, I would have done that. I said, I think if a major political party asks you to give a blessing as a clergy, you give a blessing. So in fact, the next month or 2 months later, they had a big Republican Jewish dinner and they said, okay, come give the invocation. I said, sure, I'd be happy to. And I went and I did it. But there's an example of like they had a clear say and they were right to say, I don't want my rabbi to be a Democrat or a Republican. I want him to be a rabbi.
Yeah. When I've talked to a few people on this, but Dennis Prager particularly talked about sort of the Judeo-Christian roots of the United States. Yeah. And that we need those. I was basically arguing that if we would just be governed by the Constitution, if we could just follow the words of this document, that would be enough for the civil pluralistic society that we want. And he basically was saying that no, we need to stay rooted in this Judeo-Christian idea. Does that...
Well, I wonder, I am not enough of a constitutional scholar to answer this question adequately, but I wonder if you could make the argument that the Constitution was in fact rooted in that Judeo-Christian idea, and there's a sort of dovetailing of your two arguments.
So I think that that's sort of where we ended up leaving it, that there's enough of it sort of in the framing of what we went with the Constitution.
I mean, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator. I mean, that's the Bill of Rights, but still.
Yeah,
you know.
that there's some stuff in there. I feel like there's so much more we could talk about. All right, you know, we'll circle back to some people that we talked about at the beginning. So you've mentioned that you've debated Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, some of my favorite people, and you know Prager and Shapiro and a couple other people. Do you think we're losing the ability to do this? Now, this wasn't a debate what we did here.
Right.
I really wanted to hear what you thought about these things, but just the general concept of sitting down with people and being okay with some ideas that you would agree with or disagree with.
I think what we are losing to some extent, some of the people, not all, some of the people that you mentioned there are perfectly willing to sit down and talk with people who differ with them. What I think that they're not always willing to do is to be prepared that their ideas might change. And part of the reason that that's so is because even though many people won't say it, I know this as a rabbi, you get captured by your own constituency. And what happens is, if someone who has a presence on TV or radio or whatever, if they say something that's different from what they've been saying before because they've changed their mind, they will get a gigantic onslaught from the people, by the way, whom they like and who are their followers and who are their supporters. Right. And they'll say, how, just as I mentioned with gay marriage, how could you do this to me that you always said this and now you're saying that? So there's a hardening, and part of the hardening is not the hardening of the person only, it's a hardening of the constituency behind the person. So that's a tough one. That is a tough one. I mean, I had this experience sometimes when I would debate the God stuff, and I felt like the person, and I'm sure it was true of me, although I like to think not as much, the person on the other side would make a concession to this argument or that argument, but they'd be letting down the home team. Mm-hmm. So they didn't.
And that's sort of the hardest thing to do, right?
It's a hard thing to do.
Yeah. A couple of weeks ago when that whole Bill O'Reilly thing happened, when he was getting fired, I tweeted out something to the effect of, I said, I don't know the specifics of what he did, but the fact that we revel in such public destruction of people, I think, is dangerous.
Yes.
And the tweet took off, but I also was getting an insane amount of hate. Right. And then somebody searched a tweet of mine from, I think, 2011, and found a tweet where I was sort of reveling in Keith Olbermann in one of his many firings from somewhere. And they sent it to me and they said, see, you hypocrite.
Right.
And I normally don't respond to people that are coming after me, but I just wrote, yes, I've evolved in 6
Right.
years.
Well, I think,
and I thought just that, and then I got a lot of accolades for that, but I thought,
Right.
this is so dangerous, this line of
is.
thinking, that if you thought something once,
you can't change it. And also, I'm not a big advocate of the charge of hypocrisy. I really prefer the charge of imperfection. Because the truth is, yes, I know a lot of people, for example, who defend traditional marriage and they've been married 5 times. And you say to them, they're hypocrites. But the answer is no. Part of it is you can believe something and really think that it's good and still either not be able to live up to it or be disappointed in yourself. And if you think of imperfection, then it gives people more latitude to change and more latitude to admit that they did something they shouldn't have done. If you're constantly ready to pounce, it freezes people into positions that I think are unhelpful.
So it's so interesting because you say that, and a few other things that you said, they strike me as very not religious things. Now I understand your framing.
Right, from my point of view, they are deeply religious.
No, I understand that, and that's so you're framing them within your understanding.
Right. Here's my basic.
But most people would hear that last piece about being able to change and evolve and accept this and go, that is just not religion.
And what I would say is repentance and admitting what you've done wrong and the realization that all human beings are flawed, that's the heart of the religious tradition. And this idea that you have to jump on someone whenever they do something that's bad, that to me is antithetical to the tradition that I was raised in, certainly. So.
All right, so one more for you. Now, about a half hour ago, was it during the break? We took a 10-second break. Mm-hmm. You said, I think it was on air. You said that you could beat Brigitte's ending. Now she gave me a great 5-minute. She gave me a great 5-minute ending on freedom and liberty and Western values and individualism and all of this stuff. So give me some great piece of Jewish wisdom for people that are just trying to find a little peace in the universe these days, because I think that's what people are looking for.
Without being competitive with Brigitte,
and I'm going to send
which I would
to
not
Brigitte.
do, which I would not do, because Brigitte and I are friends, and I would not begin to.
I am sending this directly to Brigitte.
Good. This is what I would say. What people have to realize is the power that they have to change other people's lives in an instant, because all of your viewers and all of your listeners know that people have said things or done things that changed their life, even though they never go back and tell them, to the 3rd grade teacher who said this, I never forgot it and it changed my life. And that realization that people can change and change each other is crucial, it's pivotal, and it's powerful. And I will close with a story that illustrates it. So there was a rabbi.
A rabbinical thing to do.
It's a very rabbinical thing to do, and here goes. It's one of my favorite stories. So there was a rabbi who used to travel around the world, and he would sing and play music, and his name was Shlomo Carlebach. He was, in his time, very well known.
I used to live on the Upper West.
There you go. So you know Carlebach, the Carlebach Synagogue. There's a Carlebach Synagogue. So once, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he went to Eastern Europe, and he was playing in this small community in the former Soviet Union. And he had the experience where everybody was cold to him. They all closed the door, either literally or metaphorically, in his face, except for one guy. And he spent all of Shabbat, all of the Sabbath there, and at the end of it, before he left, he said to this guy, he said, listen, I understand why these people don't want to hear from me. I know that they went through, the Second World War and then the jackboot of communism, and with the fall of the Soviet Union, more things, and they have shortages and winter. He says, what I don't understand you. He says, why are you so opening, and why are you so loving, and why are you so welcoming? Why are you so different? And the man said, I can tell you exactly why, and I'll tell you when it happened. Look, he said, I'm an old man, and I have lived in this town my entire life, and I remember before the First World War, it was the dead of winter, and a rumor swept through the town that the Cossacks were coming, and they were going to loot and pillage and burn and destroy. So all the parents from the town gathered up all the children, and they brought us to the rabbi's house. And they ringed around the rabbi's house all night long, and he walked up and down between the rooms where all the children slept. And I was curled up in a corner of the rabbi's study, but I couldn't sleep because it was bitter cold. And in the middle of the night, the rabbi came up behind me and he took his cloak off his shoulders and he spread it over me and he said, "Good child, sweet child." "You know," said the rabbi to Carlbach, "it has been almost 80 years since the rabbi spread his coat on me, but it still keeps me warm." Those sorts of moments, they're not just nice, they're sacred, they're religious moments. You can do them for someone else in an instant almost every day. And many years from now, even though you might not know it, it will still keep them warm.
I think you matched Brigitte. I think you did it. Rabbi Wolpe, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
And for more on Rabbi Wolpe, well, you can find him at Sinai Temple in Los Angeles and follow him on Twitter at Rabbi Wolpe. Thanks.